back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scocker, and today we're, of course, going to have another incredible episode. And it's not just me talking today. Today we have a guest. I know we haven't had a guest in a long time, and we're bringing, once again, a well-respected Twitter anon on today. And today we have Soso. You may recognize him by his black cat, Avi. He has some viral tweets, so I'm sure a lot of people have seen him. I've retweeted him many times. So, Soso, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic, Scott. You know, a long-time listener, first-time caller, and it's a real pleasure to be
That's
here.
how everyone should be. Everyone should be a long-time listener and listen to every episode multiple times. I think that's the only way you can be truly respected. But today we've got a very important topic. You know, I get a lot of criticism. They're like, Scott, you just criticize people. You never offer what we should do and like big picture ideas of like ideas we need to focus on, because they complain I denigrate the plumber option, I denigrate national divorce. So today we're going to talk about what necessarily we should focus on. What are the future prospects for the American right? We're taking a bigger picture, broader view of what's happening, rather than focusing on the news. But we will get to the news later on in the podcast, or at least one news subject. So that's just generally what we want to discuss today. So I'm going to open up the floor to Soso and say, broad question, but what should we do? What should we focus on? You had a recent article in Man's World. Man's World is a Twitter and magazine that they put out about the path to power. So how about you describe that, and also just talk more about this broad question of what the right should do to achieve power.
Sure. I think it's important to start off with sort of mentioning, like, who are we talking about when we say the right? Are we just talking about the dissident right that's on Twitter? Are we talking about the right as like this broad political populist movement that's grown out of Trump? And sort of define exactly what we're talking about. And I think it's also important to say, you do get a lot of flack for being critical of a lot of people's ideas on Twitter and in other places. But I think that's, equally important, and probably one of the most effective things that people online, figureheads, e-celebrities, whatever you want to call them, can do is shoot down bad ideas.
Yeah.
But it's also, important to positive ideas and give some suggestions on where the right should head. My opinion on that is, I think a lot of what we can do, and I'll focus the discussion mainly on the dissident right on the Twitter sphere, those sorts of characters, because that's, I'm assuming the majority of your audience. It's certainly all of my audience. And for us, I think it's really important to have well thought out ideas and be able to propagate them as far as we can, particularly into our target audience, not just the dissident right, but into the broader normie sphere. A good example is, and people have mixed opinions on the guy, but I personally like him, like Chris Rufio, or Rufo, however you say his name.
Rufo,
his CRT, sort of shtick, the effect that he's had on the education discourse has been really powerful. And he didn't really come up with that himself, not to, denigrate him at all, but this was a topic that had been discussed by the dissident right for years, about the infiltration of ideologically committed zealots into education, particularly young education. Chris Rufo was able to basically pick up that discourse and propagate it to a much wider sphere than any of us were able to. And now you see in places like Florida and other states, it being turned into real legislation. And I think that's the best model for what we can do on the dissident right, on all of our key issues.
Yeah, I think so too. And it's really a matter of ensuring we're not isolated and our message is getting out there. It really is that simple. It's like people always want to say, like, you can do individual things in your life, building, a community of like-minded people, and, maybe get us, trained in a particular trade if you want to, are doing these things, are just building up wealth. But as like a movement as a whole, I mean, it is really just simple in that we just have to get our message out there, because a lot of people don't even know like a lot of these things. A lot of people are encased in the propaganda cocoon. They get new things every day, and they'll believe whatever the media tells them. Like one day they need to be told to care about George Floyd. Next day they're caring about COVID. Next day they're caring about Ukraine. And really, a part of our strategy is to be in an information war. You could even say in an info war about what people believe and what they should, go after and achieve. But there are some things, like, I think a lot of times the right wants to engage in every fight that draws in the news, and they, strike up the banner over whatever news item there is, and they're like, this is very important. And sometimes that can lead to people caring a lot about Mr. Potato Head becoming gender neutral, or like some random school in Virginia or New Hampshire no longer sharing Dr. Seuss books, or and it's even some of the things maybe with Disney too. Even though Disney is very bad and we should punish them, but some people just get into every conflict, or as my favorite, caring about women's sports as
Right.
as a last bulwark that we need to care about. So I think in some ways we need to choose about what we're fighting over. And it's a real reminder that what we're primarily about and what differentiates us from the rest of the political sphere, and especially from conservatives, is that we're actually pushing for identity politics. And sometimes we'll go into things that the general right cares about, or that, it's the hot news item of today, but it's distracting from the identitarian struggle that is our primary purpose. And we shouldn't lose sight of that.
Yeah, I
So that's fun.
think
Yeah, go ahead.
it's probably our biggest weakness, the dissident right, is how dependent on the news cycle we are in terms of pushing discourse. We're basically only allowed to bring up our viewpoints if there's a topic in the general news sphere that aligns with those views, or maybe doesn't even align with those views, but is a topic that we can speak on. But we're completely beholden to whatever the news cycle is. That's our biggest weakness. It's very difficult to sort of spark conversation, particularly national conversation, if it hasn't already been sparked through like Fox News or your typical news sources. And that's unfortunate. And I've thought a lot about how we can sort of break away from that and start dictating the news cycle. I don't really have any great answers for that, although there is a good example for that in what Raw Ag Nationalist is doing. I have a lot of respect for him. Man's World, that's his magazine. That's who I first published with. And what he has been able to do with communicating with, I think InfoWars was the first sort of big, broader sphere that he communicated. I might be wrong on that, but certainly with his recent Tucker document, uh, his little Tucker segment, the documentary that he's doing with testosterone and the decline of man, right? Like this idea of uh, demasculization that's occurring in the West, particularly in America, but really all over uh, Western civilization. That's a topic that wasn't in the news cycle. He sort of
Yeah.
forced it into the news cycle. And I think that is the model, that's the sort of strategy that we need to move towards. How that's accomplished, I mean, Raw Egg Nationalist would be a great person to speak to on this show on that front. But
Raw
that's really it.
Nationalist, our new leader.
Yeah. Well, it's so funny, how influential he's become,
No, he
considering
is. He started a controversy last week, The Bulwark, because his book was published with a publisher that publishes some controversial works, and The Bulwark got mad about that, and they're trying to do guilt by association with because Raw Egg Nationalist has been published by the American Mind, I think, and some pretty reputable publications. So through like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, they're trying to create this guilt by association through Raw Egg Nationalists. But I don't. No one really paid attention to the article. But yeah,
right.
he is getting a lot of attention.
And I know you wanted to go into some white pills later on in the show, and I'll save my point for that. But it is nice to see how little those sort of hit pieces have an effect on him and the discourse in general.
But there is an advantage to being anonymous, I think, and not really tied directly to any groups, is that people are more willing to engage anons, especially if they don't necessarily have a footprint of like what they're about and like their ideas. And they could just retweet them and just imagine, like, well, I like this guy because of his workout tips, or I like this guy for his food tips, or something that they, that everyone can be agreeable, or that they can't be necessarily controversial and they like. And then Bronze Age Pervert has definitely benefited from this, is that he has probably said some things that are very controversial. He doesn't necessarily have the footprint of some of the like figures that you would have associated with the alt-right back in the day. And he's able to navigate, this tricky terrain where you're in, and I guess the terrain between, mainstream conservatism and like the dissident right, and he's able to navigate it and get more attention than say other people, because they don't necessarily have that whole footprint. And when you're anonymous, you can just, and you're not necessarily associated with any group that is like on a hate watch or anything. You're just doing your own thing and you're a poster, and you could say that like, oh, these posts that I did that were maybe controversial, no one paid attention to, or they were just said an irony. That does give you a certain advantage to be elevated. So it is like, funny thing is that if you had necessarily a face to what you're doing, they're more leery about promoting you. But if you are just an anonymous poster, they're more willing to elevate you just because you are really a blank page where it's just your words that are writing from there. And it's almost ridiculous for mainstream journalists to like write a hit piece on someone called Raw Egg Nationalist or somebody else, because it's like
Bronze Age Pervert's name is like intended to cause that effect.
Yeah, it's intended to cause the effect, and it is like a ridiculous thing where it's like, oh, this person. But if it's like a standard name, it's like, oh, we can attack this person, we can look into them, we can find out everything that they're about. But when you're just somebody on Twitter with this goofy name, or some or kind of this over the top name, it gives you a degree of deniability, and I guess maybe that would be the correct term. It gives you a type of cover to go into these circles that would have been denied to people, 4 or 5 years ago, especially if they were had operating under their own name or attached to these groups and websites that they put into the forbidden territory.
Yeah, and you could probably speak to this a lot more than I can, but it certainly seems that people are a lot more vindictive. Our enemies are a lot more vindictive when you have your name and your face attached to what you say. They're much more, inspired to pin all of your beliefs to your persona and your name than if you were anonymous under a pseudonym.
That's true. That's why I have to say I'm 6'2", 187 IQ. So whatever I say, it's attached to my height and IQ, and it gives me a degree of respectability and intelligence that they just can't deny. So it just makes them so mad whenever I say something and they see my height and IQ attached to it, and they have to believe it, because when a tall, smug, handsome young man with a 187 IQ says it, you just gives it a degree of authority that you just have to listen to. So I have kind of prevented these attacks on me through that. But it is true. It is a lot harder when you have your own face out there, and you also have like less freedom to speak on things, because everything that you say, it's gonna come. You have to remember it could one day come back to haunt you, or be used in an attack. Like for even my docs piece, like pretty much everything that was in there, I was like, I don't even remember writing this.
Right.
And it's, for anons, I mean, if there's like a big hit piece or whatever, but it's like people generally don't go comb through anons in the same way, unless they're seen as like a leader of a group or as a leader of something. They don't necessarily comb through these posts and everything. And it's also like ridiculous. It's like Huffington Post writes a whole 5,000 word article on raw egg nationalists. There's like a ridiculous factor to this that no editors can be like, hell no, you're not writing this article on a guy named Raw Egg Nationalist. Sorry, we're not doing this. But they have to do that with a certain person who has their face out there. So there are a lot of advantages, and that's actually one thing I've always been pro anonymity, is that anonymity is key to the free speech battle. It is an essential part. If we didn't have anonymity on these online platforms, we would not be where we are today. Well, some people may think that's bad, but I mean, as like our ideas wouldn't be that mainstream. Like the average mainstream right would still be stuck in like John McCainism and all of that, and talking about how we need amnesty, and probably we'd have a giant George Floyd statue built in the Capitol right now because everyone would agree to this stuff. You have to think as like how awful politics were in the 2000s, and that was pre social media, where anons are able to get alternative viewpoints out there that they wouldn't have been able to in the 2000s and 90s. And so that's anonymity is like a real key factor. If they did get rid of anonymity, that would, I always say, they would turn social media into LinkedIn. LinkedIn is terrible. LinkedIn, it's like, people complain about social media platforms and like, oh, there's so much leftism on there. You can go on LinkedIn and you'll see like how Black Lives Matter makes me a better manager. And that'll be like the type of stuff. It combines like this corporate bourgeois viewpoint of the world with wokeism. Like it's not complete like the type of Tumblr wokeism or the stuff you would see on Twitter with, some of the more ridiculous stuff. It's making it palatable to the guy who's like an accountant or a lawyer or working in a business firm, and like it makes it like fit in with their training and how they become a better salesman and a better worker, is that they need to get this woke shit in there. And if anyone challenges that, you then get fired because it's like, oh, this guy is criticizing that. Let's see where he works. Let's see all his connections. Let's let them know that he's a racist. And that is the absolute world they want, which, these like stupid HR leftists can control the discourse and post this asinine BS couched in like corporate speak about how we need all to worship Black Lives Matter and build a giant George Floyd statue. And if you criticize it, the HR department is going to hear about this at your work and you're going to lose your job. And that's really the ideal world they want, is LinkedIn.
Right. Well, LinkedIn is the perfect window into the prevailing ideology of the state and the state's power, whether it be through corporate influence or the state itself. So it's impossible, like you said, to really have free speech in that environment. And likewise, in my opinion, anonymity, or however you say it, being anon is the most important free speech component, because it breaks you away from their systems of control, and it allows you to speak your mind, and you can be very influential as an anon, probably more influential. And to get rid of that would destroy us entirely, the dissident right, and it would really cause this sort of LinkedIn ideology to become the only acceptable discourse and the only discourse anyone's ever going to hear.
Yeah. LinkedIn world is what they want. And that is like, that's how a lot of people come to accept these things, is it's not necessarily through the kind of outrageous stuff that is highlighted by Libs of TikTok, which I think that Libs of TikTok's a great account. I think that's actually one of the more effective propaganda accounts. Like some people give Libs of TikTok like some crap, they claim it's like cringe and stuff. But it is like, think about this, like just one woman out in LA collecting TikToks of these insane teachers has shaped public policy in this country. This one person just collecting TikToks and showing what leftists say in their own words on their own videos. Like this is what they actually believe, and just highlighting that with just a little bit of commentary. And her commentary is just like, this is like a teacher says, short summary, And then in their own words, they're showing like how outrageous our education system is getting, and that has made people want to make changes and reform. It's just one person doing this through an internet account, and that is like the power of propaganda. It's like what she's doing is probably more powerful, more impactful than setting up your own community in the middle of nowhere. Not saying that like setting up your own community is bad, and that could ultimately be good, and that could impact your day-to-day life. But when it comes to the larger scale struggle and the national discourse, just this one Twitter account has done more than a lot of other efforts we can ever think about. You know, it's like governors and the number one cable news host relies on this one Twitter account to get it out there.
Yeah, one of the most effective things. Oh, go ahead. Oh, I was going to say one of the most effective things one of the most effective weapons that we have on the internet and in our sphere is criticism of the regime and the regime's ideology and the absurd things that it allows. And the Twitter that we have today is the way that it is because of how effective that weapon was in 2016, when it was a total free for all. You could reply under blue checks and get, just totally ratio them and expose how stupid and fundamentally flawed their worldview is. And this sort of ghettoization of the right and the very stringent censorship tactics that are used when you just, try and engage with people outside of this sphere developed because of how effective that weapon is. Like myself, my account has sort of grown with the specific target of the American military and criticizing it in two ways. One, directly criticizing it and its failures and the sort of ideology as well as the structural and doctrinal changes that have been made in the American military that have made it, a shadow, if even that, of its former self, as well as providing a analysis of military tactics and war and strategy and doctrine that you're not going to get from people who are, in uniform and present themselves as, the military. Like these people discuss ridiculous things like my experience with sexual harassment in the Navy. Like this is what gets popular in their spheres. But that's not what people want when they're looking for military stuff. They don't want to hear about the time a staff sergeant rubbed you the wrong
Speak
way.
for yourself. I love these sexual harassment stories because I love empowering female sailors and female soldiers, and this is what makes us have the greatest military on earth. So when I hear about these heart-wrenching sexual harassment stories where this woman who has a higher body count than Azov, it talks about her, that there was some guy who hit on her on a ship. I'm just, it breaks me. It really makes me break down into tears.
Yeah, I mean, you look at some of the technology developments that have come out of Russia and China, things like hypersonic missiles and stuff. But I'm telling you, we are the tip of the spear for single mother maternity uniforms.
Oh yeah, it is true. Yeah, no. It is like that. But I mean, yeah, it's like, but even like some of that military stuff goes into like the LinkedIn mindset. And when I was going before I went on congratulating libs of TikTok, which go to that point is like the reason why they wanted to dox libs of TikTok is because they're so effective. And really, the doxing, I like that they push back and they're all attacking and they're very upset about this and attacking. But we have to remember is like Libs of TikTok is going to be fine because this person is reaches so many people and is seen as a folk hero by normie conservatives. Everyone from like normie conservatives, even like center like libertarians, to like the far right and the dissident right, that she'll be fine. I mean, and people are automatically see the media as the villain in this. But the thought is the reason why they wanted to dox her is because they wanted to end that account, and they know that this person is that the reason why that the Washington Post, decided that we're going to invest all these resources into finding this person is because this person is doing an effective job at attacking the left and getting a message out there that they don't want to get. And that's a main part of the doxing is that doxing worked very effectively against the alt-right and to, censoring it and persecuting it. But it is a white pill to see when someone gets doxxed, in a very effective account, and it just makes them even bigger and more powerful, and everyone hates the media as a result of it. And so I think that that's a very white pilling story, and it's due to the popularity of this account. Like I think Libs of TikTok probably gets a lot of the issues, but that person has made and has ensured that the account has such a broad reach that it's not just the purview of of a right wing ghetto. It's something that can drive Fox News and talk radio, and that is pretty effective. But going back to the LinkedIn point, is that a lot of the indoctrination that happens with these middle class normie types goes to the feeling that this is how we have to operate as a business. Is like, if you want to be a respectable middle class normie person, this is what this is what you believe. And LinkedIn is very good at getting this. And this is a point I made when I think it was Lauren Southerner making that time. Not attacking Lauren. Lauren is
The original alt-right queen.
is a friend of the podcast. I'm not attacking her, but she was being a little too sympathetic to the normies. I mean, I don't know if sympathetic is the right word, but praising them a little bit too much, as imagining that they're a little bit more base than they are. When the average normie that I'm thinking about, the average like middle class person in their 30s who's just like going to work and their sole pursuit is just having a nice material life, is they're going to accept so much shit and just ignore like the terrible things because they know that that's going to interfere with the nice life that they're trying to live, and they know the consequences of it. And then they go onto LinkedIn to see what the proper views are. It's like, what good businessmen believe, and like what makes a good businessman seem like a good person. And this is where they get their viewpoint from, and that's how they develop a lot of this. A lot of the insanity we see just in the corporate world and just in day-to-day life, where you can be in a nice middle-class suburban neighborhood and you'll see Black Lives Matter signs out in front of their homes.
Yeah, it's kind of disgusting how much a normie will accept as long as they're comfortable and given, the economic I don't want to say freedom, but the ability to live their life undisturbed from the wider world.
Economic prosperity, I would say. I think people have more debt and there are more problems, but we still are a very prosperous country. The difference is we have there's a spiritual and mental crisis, but there's not an economic crisis, so to speak. But go ahead.
Well, it's all relative, right? So we might be so much more prosperous than other nations, but if that prosperity declines, it feels like the world is ending, which is why I think some of the most effective opportunities for our sort of discourse emerge out of these crises. Like Trump, was a perfect example of, a bad economy, a sort of the trickle down effects of policies by the state regarding foreign policy with the wars, in addition to, the economic nonsense and the inability to sort of fix what came out of, the 2007, 2008, 2009 financial crisis and all of that. His popularity can be directly correlated to that, in addition to things like, NAFTA and the deindustrialization of America. And now we have this opportunity here, given inflation and debt and a lot of other problems like the supply chain, that sort of make normies uncomfortable. It sort of robs them of their of the economic prosperity that they're accustomed to when they're having to pay $5 at the fucking gas tank, that kind of thing. So it's really important for us to realize that and sort of marshal our discourse in a way that addresses those things and gives explanations to normies. Of course, they're not going to be listening to us specifically unless they follow us, but that's pretty rare. But gives
people who might listen to us, they may listen to.
Yeah, exactly. Like Fox News and that sort of thing. That gives them good punching points against the current regime and that sort of thing, that will drift the broad right's target audience, right, the white middle class, towards viewpoints and ideology that is sympathetic to where we stand, if not outright agrees with it.
Yeah, no, I would fully agree with that. And one thing, going back to we need maybe a different term for normies because one of the things with Southern's points is that she was trying to say that like the NPC maybe not be normal, that there's another type of normal, but it's like, what is the real normal? It's like, we have to remember that we are very abnormal. That is not a argument to go out and be full on freaks and just like hate. Make sure you're as revolting and repelling to the bourgeoisie as possible. I think you still need to look like not complete freaks, but you have to remember we are outsiders now, and that we are, because of our free thinking and the fact that we understand facts and logic, that does make us very different from normal people and what we see in the world that others don't. I mean, the average person is just, what really gets them excited is sports or something. I had a relative who, over Christmas was like cussing out the TV over like his favorite football team not doing well. And I was like, I couldn't imagine getting upset over this. But you have to remember is that there's millions of more people are more willing to like destroy their TV over their favorite team losing than they are of their kid being told that that they're evil because they're white.
Right.
And that is something that you have to keep in mind, is that is like the normie mindset, is that they're like their kid comes home and is like, Daddy, they said that all white people are evil and responsible for slavery. And it's like, well, I guess that's history. And then they see the Browns lose, and they're like, the motherfucking Browns, how the fuck are you doing this? And they're like, throwing their TV down over the Browns losing, and it's like, you do need a healthy bit of skepticism of the masses, I think, with the people. And there's some type of, you don't need hatred of them, or just like the kind of Julius Evola, like, I'm an aristocrat and, you're so beneath me. But you do need to recognize like where they're at and how you need to push them along. And some on the right imagine that the that normies are very much like the normies in the film V for Vendetta, which is different from the graphic novel. But in V for Vendetta, I always thought this is like the strangest part of the movie, or really the dumbest
They all
part.
put on the masks.
Well, not that, but no, leading up to that is that like V is getting a hold of the programming, and they're starting to realize this regime is really bad. But the middle class like family that's watching this is living in affluence. They have a nice apartment, a nice flat screen TV, nice couch, nice furniture. They're dressed nice. And just because some dude in a mask is telling them that like they're living in a tyranny, they're like, this guy's right. We're rising up. And it's like, there's no way you're going to rise up. You're experiencing mass amount of affluence from this regime. You would be pissed off at the guy at the mask. You would be wanting to demand his head for him interrupting your TV program rather than them just like rising up. And that was like always the weirdest part. And I think some people on the right take that to heart, is that just these people who are living in affluence where everything else is going great in their life, even though the country is going to hell, and that they're just going to suddenly rise up because a dude in a Guy Fawkes mask is telling them the government is tyranny. Don't listen to the government. They would be more mad at that guy for interrupting their TV programming than they would be at their government.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to take, normie is the best word for it, but I agree that there should be a different term for it. But you have to take the normie.
NPC is probably a better term. I mean, there are very good normies, because we really probably need to say NPC more, even though NPC was like now a little bit of a dead meme. It was so true when it first came out, of just like how the the NPCs operate. So I think that would be a good better term. Sorry, I know I'm interrupting, but just continue.
No. I mean, there needs at some point people need to sit down and sort of hammer out the terms and definitions for what we're going to say. Like who we're addressing, right? Like the white middle class. Like, are we Americans? Are we traditional Americans? Are we heritage Americans? Like, it's there's no solid list of terms yet. I think a lot of work could be done there. but I digress. The point I'm trying to make here is you have to accept them for who they are and where they're at, and not really get so emotionally invested that they're so far from where we're at. But it's important to also remember that, and I mentioned this in my article, that we can't be ghettoed away from them. Like the only real tool that we have for political influence for any sort of change in this country, whatever you think the end state's going to be, whether it's American Caesarism or total civil war or national divorce, like that's ever going to happen. But whatever you think the end state is, whatever you think the end state is, you have to realize that our only tool available to us is populism. It's
Yes.
influencing that class of people, the white middle class, into getting politically involved. And you're not going to do that by intentionally alienating them or mocking them or laughing at their sort of uh, propagandized position, even if it is laughable.
Yeah, I think so, a degree of mockery is okay, but it is like a point that I would to go to your point is like we can't be openly condemning sports ball. Like going into that, I think that's like one example of it is even though I've told people that they need to boycott specific sports because they're just like so bad that like if you turn it on, they literally have the black national anthem playing, and it's like okay, this is a little bit too much. I know you like the game. I like watching sports. I really like watching football. I do like to go to family gatherings, and I become a total normie there where I get really into a college football game, and then I'm like, oh, I can't believe they missed that tackle and stuff. So I understand that point, like the joy of watching sports. But we sports is the opiate of the masses, but we can't go into full like like Richard Spencer, like sports ball.
Yeah. Or Gab.
Yeah, it's like that, like because like Spencer had a famous moment where he went to Auburn, and there was a lot of like right wingish guys there who are like, "Oh, I'm told this guy is like affiliated with Trump. I want to hear what he's about." And then it's like audience was like fairly like, "I want to hear what he has to say." And the whole time he just talked about how much he wants to ban college football and stuff. He's like, "I hate college football. We should ban it. You're just losers and idiots for wanting to listen to this, watch this." And the whole crowd was like, what the hell is this guy talking about? I love Auburn football. And they all like got up and left. And so it's like alienating your audience. So, I mean, we can talk a little bit about like sports is opiate the masses, but like going full like sports ball posting, you do need to retreat from that. You also need to retreat. Also, I think a better example, because I actually am more pro this, is like the anti-suburbs posting, which is like, where else are the white middle class supposed to live? Like, I mean, you
Right,
could
exactly.
choose like where you want. If you really like a rural area or your small town, like your family's whole there, like more power to you if you want to live there. But for most people, that's not going to be where they're going to live. They need to live where it's near work, and there's like similar people around them. They're going to live in suburbs. I mean, suburbs might not be the Atlantis.
Right.
It might not be the Atlantean paradise, but like in the way America exists today, and like how our cities are, and how like your other options, it's just where it's going to be. And most of the people who live in suburbs are just like nice, good-looking people, wholesome. But it's just it's a little banal, and there are some peculiarities to it. But like being like total like we need to nuke the suburbs. I'm like, where else are they supposed to live?
Well, it's
Like I'm
this
pro suburb.
it's this cross between it's where they cross the line between like a legitimate and healthy criticism towards, just pure misanthropy.
Yeah,
And I know it's funny, you had a guy, I forget the account, it's not that important, but he was very critical of your takes on the ruralism that you were criticizing. And then he posted a poll about, where do you guys live? And like 85% of the people who responded were either suburban or urban. Only like
yeah.
15% were legitimately rural,
No,
if
it was
even
only
that.
10% that said rural, and then like 20% some small town. But small town could mean suburb, or it could mean even like a city of 50,000 to people, which they would see as like is urban area. So it's like it's unclear what and that was like 19%. So it's like and they're wanting to exterminate 2/3 of their audience, like 70% of their
Yeah.
audience, and it's like, it doesn't really work. Like, we can't have an American Khmer Rouge when only 19% of our population lives in rural areas, and most of that population is old pensioners who are dependent on the system to survive. And people just like, the right is really prone to fantasies and to a type of performative transgression where people just like say very edgy things like, this is like destroy cities, like we're just gonna live in like archaic ways of living, we're returning back to our primitive sources. And people just love these like very edgy transgressive slogans to do. And then when you look at that, it's like, what are you trying to do? You're just like trying to perform people and do this chest thumping and to look like you're tough and more base than anyone else. But it really, when it comes down to like a serious political ideology, it's just something silly.
Yeah, and Bap on his very original Twitter account had a tweet that's probably one of his most famous tweets, but put the cities to the sword and fire, that sort of thing. And it's been shared, 1,000,000, 200,000,000 times. But you don't see him going out and just continually hammering on this point about nuking the cities or the sickness of urbanism, because politics is about the people. And the majority of the people of this country, like you said, they live in, urban, suburban areas. And becoming this sort of, and this fantastic idea of they're going to be this grand rural uprising against the cities and we're all going to starve them out and all this. It's just a fantasy. And the people that advocate this thing, they're not in charge of 1,000-acre corporate farms. They're not in charge of food distribution or anything like that. It's
Yeah,
just,
and when you tell them that, they get into more sloganeering. It's like, we'll just take them over and kill those people. And it's like, well,
yeah.
who's going to run it? It's like, these guys aren't trained to it. And it's like, a lot of those farms operate on illegal migrant labor. And it's like, we'll just find people to work it. And it's like, you're engaged in a revolution, but now you need all that young manpower to start picking fruit for your food supply. And it's like, I don't know if this is going to really work out. But it's like, they're very resistant. When you bring up the facts and logic, they get even angrier and more insistent on that their ideas are going to work.
Yeah, I mean it's just misanthropic masturbation at the end of the day. And whatever you think the end state's going to be, or whatever you want the end state to be, like, I mean, I'll be honest, there's no one in here in the dissident right that would prefer a total free for all, Einsatzgruppen mode than old Soso here. But
That's not true. We're gonna have to disavow that. That's not true. We do
I'm
not
just
want
kidding.
that. We
But
want we just want we want peace, and we want power through peaceful and political means, and we are just
sure.
normal Republicans. So
Oh,
I am
I'm just making
fully
jokes here.
opposed to
Everyone
that.
knows down in my heart I'm a dark DeSantis stan.
Yeah,
But
that's right. We want Dark DeSantis to, through facts and logic and through effective use of state power, to free us from our oppression.
yeah, well, the thing is, like, whatever you think, my point is, whatever you think the end state is going to be, or whatever you want the end state to be, even if it's absurd and violent and totally disavowed, you need to do all of the things that any other end state and any other plan would require. Things like taking part in, local and state elections and even federal elections, taking control of parts of the institution, dictating discourse across, sympathetic news sites and news stations. All of whatever you want, the plan is the same regardless. But these people aren't pragmatic, and they have no sense of what it takes to acquire power, or what it takes to do any of the things that they fantasize about. And you have to have, like I said, like, whatever you want, like, the plan is the same regardless. And the mechanisms to which we move this country into a direction that we would like to see is the same. So all of these sort of, go out into the woods and homestead and raise base children and homeschooling and all that. And I support homeschooling, don't get me wrong. But it's just asking to get ruby ridged at the end of the
And
day.
not everyone could do that either. I mean, like,
Yeah.
if you could do that, more power to you. I don't think anyone's going to criticize you for that. But I think recommending that as like everyone going to do it, it's like, Not everyone's going to be able to do that. And even with like the homeschooling, like homeschooling is a little bit more of a pragmatic idea, but a lot of people just can't do homeschooling because, maybe both of them have to work. And then you could be like, well, only one of them should work. And like, well, due to the nature of society right now, that might not be an option. And some of them might not be like, maybe some of them should not teach their kids. And they also pay taxes for these schools. Like the problem with the right is that our idea for everything, our solution to everything is escapism. When
Exactly.
we pay for this stuff, this is like, it's outrageous that our schools are so bad. You're paying for that. Like even if you have your kid in homeschool, your tax dollars are paying for other kids to be indoctrinated, and more of those kids are going to be indoctrinated than whatever education you're giving your kid. And then your kid could be very well be indoctrinated too, due to just like contact with other people. I mean, you can't keep them enclosed in a controlled space forever. Eventually they're going to go out on their own, and they may have very different ideas for you. If you guys have ever met homeschoolers, like a lot of those people, like they rebel too, just as much as any other kid. So there is no the only escape is victory, as I always like to say.
Exactly.
And working towards victory, it's not as sexy or as like exciting as national divorce or rural homestead or civil war or anything. It's a lot of it is just like diligent labor. It's a lot of this stuff that we're even like seeing with like the legislation. Like I've been very critical of Chris Rufo, but I think what Florida and of the DeSantis cult, but I think what DeSantis did with the Stop Woke Act in Florida is really good, because now it's going to go after diversity, inclusion, and equity training, not just in schools but in businesses and in the government. And that's like the type of legislation you need to see everywhere, and you really need to push back on that stuff. And now we're seeing a lot of these guys do that, and this stuff is not as like exciting as as these fantasies of you and your militia taking on the federal government or whatever, but it is like necessary. And to even get to the point, as you mentioned earlier, to like of a national divorce or a separation or whatever, is that you need to have influence over institutions and power and reach to a wide audience to even have that. Imagine like in the Spanish Civil War, if Franco was just a plumber. And he's like a local plumber, and he's like, I'm gonna lead a revolution against this government. And it's like, no, you're not gonna do that. It's the fact that he's a general and that other generals agreed with him, that they were able to have this power, and the fact that the Catholic Church supported it, because the Catholic Church saw the government as anti-religious. And also the peasantry is like, well, the military and the church is on one side, I guess I should listen to this side because I like the military and I like the church. And still power does still come from these institutions, and they are in enemy hands, but we do need to compete. Maybe try to compete over those institutions, not let them be the purview of our enemies. And we in the process of building a counter elite, we do need people who are skilled with running these institutions or have an idea of running these institutions. Some guy who is a welder out in rural America is not going to know how to run these institutions. He may know how to do a lot of great things that a lot of people don't know about, and he may be a great guy, but he's not going to have that ability to just go in and know how to understand this stuff and have the authority and the networks and connections to run these things. And we really do need to focus on building a counter elite.
Yeah, and I say this in my article, and essentially I make the point, it's the most effective weapon we could possibly have is, if your talents if you're a young man and your talents sort of disposition you to specific institutions, whether it be the military, whether it be the political apparatus, both national and local, whether it be things like even business and industry, that sort of thing, don't shy away from it because you're based and red pilled. I mean, you have to understand you're basically operating in the belly of the beast at this point. But that just requires a degree of cognizance that you should have anyway. Don't go walking down the cubicles shouting you endorse Hitler and violence. But we need
well, you shouldn't
people.
do that at any point either. That's what I say. You do
Right.
not need to be like Blep Sama here in your workplace.
Yeah. But, don't be afraid to enter them. You should enter them. We need people to enter them. And something that you mentioned earlier that I think is important regarding Florida and DeSantis. I would say even more important than just the education bill itself, but the steps that have followed after that in regards to targeting Disney and its economic influence and sort of uh, privileges that it had at the behest of the state is probably the most important and most powerful thing that has happened in recent times and should be continued on every front with every business that stands in opposition to us. There's sort of this chicken and a cart, or chicken and a cart, shit and an egg, cart and a horse situation where is it the state? Is it corporate? Is it academia? Like, who is the origin of this ideology and the influence? And it's sort of irrelevant. What matters is that these institutions are occupied and they do have power. And if we can take control of one, for example, the state, particularly the state of Florida, and use that state power against them to harm them economically, we absolutely should. You can do this sort of thing with like tech giants. You can do this sort of thing with a myriad of different industries that stand in opposition to us, or are rather controlled by people who stand in opposition to us. That's the model. That's how we move forward.
Yeah, no, and I agree. And this has been a surprisingly pro DeSantis podcast today. I mean, some
I
of my
hate to say
listeners
it.
may be like, Scott, are you giving up on Trump? Are you becoming pro DeSantis? I've been critical enough of DeSantis, so we will go praise. Calling balls and strikes. This has been a good. It was a good week for DeSantis. He did a lot of things. We'll see what the Disney thing, how that works out with punishing it. The one thing is it may have unintended consequences for it because it may lead to like higher taxes for the people who live in that area. But it's good. They need to retaliate against these businesses. They do need to stop giving these subsidies, and they are being more willing to do this. I remember, last year Georgia wanted to punish. I think it was Delta or one of the airlines that
Yeah.
opposed their election reform laws, and they wanted to get rid of their subsidies for it. And it didn't get really passed through, but it does set a good precedent that they should start punishing these companies that feel like that they are like, we hate our local state that gives us all these subsidies and we condemn them as racist. And it's like, okay, well, your perks are gone, we're taking away your subsidies, we're taking away your tax breaks, and you're going to either so if you want your tax breaks back, you're going to shut up about our policies and stop acting as a tool of the left. And I think it is good that the state is doing this. I think there may be, we'll see how it turns out, but I think both of those things that DeSantis did are very good. But going to what we need to focus on, and people are always like, it's all this big stuff and people get distracted and everything. The real two big things we need to focus on and direct into normies are this, is like, one, make them understand like race, ethnicity, and identity, like have that type of awareness. That is like critical to like making Americans like waking up, is like making them aware of those things, because a lot of, especially for the white middle class, they like to pretend none of those things exist. It's like, I just judge by content of character, I don't see these things at all, these are just normal people, like, oh, like that. They love to imitate that, and we really need to like push that, like, no, you need this awareness, you need that identity awareness, and you need to see yourself as a part of a people, not just as a little individual existing in this country called the United States of America. So that's one. The second thing is we need to make divorce people, or their sense of conception and self, from the globalist American empire. They need to stop seeing, when they see the flag flying in Afghanistan and then it being drawn down from the embassy, you need to stop seeing that as a humiliation for you, but as a humiliation for an alien empire that rules over you. Not seeing it as a part of your identity. Because usually for most people, when they see their nation like have humiliations and defeats, and this has been common throughout history, they see that as a defeat and a humiliation for themselves. It's like, it's my tribe getting defeated and conquered here. But that's not what's happening with America. It's some foreign power that's ruling over you, that's hostile to your interests and wants to replace you with other people. And that's why you need to stop seeing yourself as represented by the globalist American empire. And making those two things apparent to normies is our critical focus. That's what we need to focus on, and that's what we need to make people aware of going forward. And I think it's just the two key things that we need to do, and the best way to do that is through propaganda. And once you make people, like, there's millions of people who have that awareness and understanding, you can then move on to other things.
Yeah, exactly. And to address your former point regarding race, it's something you saw a lot in the early alt-right that you don't really see too much today, and it might be a factor of the censorship that we've had to endure. But at the beginning, there was a lot of sort of propaganda built around this idea, a lot like what Libs of TikTok is doing, in presenting articles, news events of uh, these horrific crimes that these minorities commit, and just being like, "Yeah, explain that. Like, you can't sit there and look at all this disproportionate crime and say, we're all really just the same. It's just that they don't have as nice of a Shake Shack in their neighborhood. Like, it's ridiculous." I think more of that would be particularly effective. Really, the only person I see doing that to any large degree is Steve Saylor. Salute to him. But yeah, I think those sorts of things, and particularly another good point, a sub point of that is when it comes to immigration and presenting things like uh, the crime that illegal immigrants and really immigrants in general, but you're going to get more traction with illegal immigrants at this point. But it should be said of all immigrants really uh, should be presented and amplified and propagandized. The story that came out, in the last couple of days of that National Guard soldier drowning to save migrants, like, is that really what we need to be doing? Like, is that is that what
And
Americans
apparently
want?
those guys were involved were traffickers too, and they weren't
Yeah,
even like the
exactly.
migrants. They were the ones that were the coyotes or whatever. So, yeah, I agree. And this is what this is what your taxpayer dollars are going towards, and you need
Yeah,
to
and I
create that
I think
awareness.
that story specifically should it should be used by the people that can use it propagandally to say, like, what are we doing there? Like, is this the essence of Americanism? Don't let it get co-opted by uh, normie conservatives and you know these pro-immigration conservatives who are like, oh, this brave soldier selflessly gave his life to save these people. It's like, no, like, he shouldn't have even been there. Shouldn't have had to be there. Should have been a fucking wall. Anyway, but to address your latter point, I think when it comes to divorcing our target, the white middle class, from these symbols and from this idea of America, I agree with you fundamentally. I just think I don't know how effective any amount of propaganda could be to make that subset of the population turn their back on the flag or not stand for the national
Well,
anthem.
I don't know if the flag. I think it's because you gotta be careful about this, because I think the one thing is, like, you can't be full on anti-America, but you need to create like a difference between America or globalist American empire. Or as a point is like as our friend Nemitz makes, is like a difference between Americans and USians, like, the real Americans and paper Americans. And you need to, yeah, it is a fine line to doing that, because you got to not go to the point where you're like burning a flag
Right.
or that, like, but you do need to see, because the empire still uses these symbols that people rally around to win them over for stupid causes. I mean, they did this with the Iraq War, and this is why I think a lot of the alt-right back in the day was very anti-American, because they saw what American patriotism had been exploited for in Iraq, and just like all the stupid rhetoric and just general
Yeah.
idiocy that was associated with that. But you just have to be careful with it. It is a fine line that you need to cross, and you need to be careful that it doesn't become you burning a flag in public or something of that
Right.
sort.
Well, I think historically, the person that did it the best, of course, he had missteps in this direction in various ways, but the person that did it the very best was Trump, and
Yeah.
particularly his anti-war stance in regards to Iraq and Afghanistan. He very clearly laid it out to his voters and to American generals, like, it's their war, and we're dying for it, and we're spending all this money and all this blood and treasure for nothing. And he was able to differentiate the ruling elite and the regime from Americans and spin it in a way that highlighted the difference between the two. Uh, how you sort of copy that, it's sort of a case by case basis. You have to, like you said, walk a fine line because it's uh, one of the most potent things that, or symbols for our sort of target demographic is like a bunch of fucking eagles, a bunch of red, white, and blue flags, like the typical sort of uh, imagery that you would
Americana
see at
stuff, yeah.
America shit. Like the imagery you would see at a Trump rally where they're decked head to foot from in American flag apparel and chanting USA, USA. Like that's still very powerful, and we should. I think the strategy is to co-opt it in some way. How you do that is a tougher question, but
We
I
sort
do
of
agree.
already are doing that, and the left is doing a job for us by declaring all these symbols white supremacy and just evil and toxic. So they are doing some of the work for us in a way that it wasn't existing in the Bush years, where or even Obama, because they were trying to appropriate Americanism and Americana to elevate multiculturalism and diversity and like the new America they were creating. But they're now embarrassed by these symbols and patriotism in general, and they think that patriotism is code word for white supremacy. So they don't want to associate with this stuff, and that is a gift to us. And that now American nationalism is much more problematic than it was in the 90s and 2000s, which creates an opportunities for us to take back these symbols and make them represent the true American nation, not the globalist American empire.
Right, and if you look at like the George Floyd race riots and all that sort of thing, like the rioters in those, they weren't marching with American flags. They had black fists and
They're burning flags,
LGBTQ.
I think, in
Yeah, they
some
were burning
cases.
flags, rainbow flags, like all that shit. These are the symbols that they're adopting, and we should absolutely let them and sort of take back the traditional symbols of America as and sort of tie it intrinsically to who we are as the dissident right, and not just conservatives in general, but us specifically.
Oh, and I agree, and I've long advocated for this position, and I still advocate for it. So, shifting gears a little bit, as I wanted to bring up a news topic that a lot of people are talking about, and I wanted to get Soso's thoughts on this. And apparently, Elon Musk is going to be buying Twitter. It may not. It looks like it's a finalized deal. It looks like it's actually happening. We're ready to have Elon Twitter. So, and a lot of people are. I can already see the cognitive elite question. People were going to get mad if I didn't address this on today's episode. So, what are your thoughts on Twitter becoming Elon occupied territory, of them finally having an African American owner?
Yeah, I think in general it's good. He's made some remarks, sort of disparaging anonymous accounts, which concern me. Hopefully, we can get people in his ear to sort of rectify that. I think part of the problem for him is because he's very involved on Twitter. He tweets pretty actively, not as much as Trump ever did, but he has a pretty active Twitter presence. And a lot of people that criticize him on Twitter are also anonymous, like leftists and that kind of thing. Uh, and they're probably filling his mentions with garbage. So I can see where he would be like, no, fuck these people. Like, put your name behind what you're saying. But he needs to understand what we laid out at the very beginning of the show, the regards to the importance of being anonymous as it pertains to free speech. But outside of that specifically, he seems to be very pro free speech, or at least as much as anyone could be at his position. And that's ultimately good. I mean, really, could you do worse than who's currently running Twitter in regards to free speech and our own positions? Any change in management would be welcome. I don't really think you can get any more draconian or any more, censorious than it kind of currently is.
Yeah,
So
he
I'm all
can't be
for
any
it.
worse. I agree with that point. And he does have a respect for free speech that I don't think their current management does. And so, well, we'll see how it goes. I mean, gives us hope. I mean, if you have any further thoughts, throw them out there on that.
I mean, really, my only other take on it is I judge a lot of things by the enemy's reaction to it. And when they get really upset and really scared about things, even if I don't necessarily agree or am in the same boat as whatever they're upset about, generally that points to me as a good sign.
Yeah, no, I agree, and we'll have to see. I'm a little bit more cautiously skeptic than some other people. Like some people think this is like the greatest thing ever, but as you said, his comments on anonymity, his also thing is like if you're making both the far right, if both the far right and the far left are upset with your policies, you're probably doing it right. And it's like, I don't know about that.
Yeah.
We'll see. But we'll see. I mean, it does. I think he will be better than current management, but if we're all banned, then I'm going to quickly change my opinion. I think that people should be a little bit more skeptic, a little bit more cautious about this than they are initially. But we'll see. It could turn out to be really well, but
Yeah, I mean, I don't see
anything bad he will do. Current management would have already done. So that's my opinion about it. It can't be any worse than what we have.
Right, exactly. And I've seen some pretty wild takes like, oh, he's going to restore Trump to Twitter and like everyone's getting their suspended accounts back and all that. I don't know if that's necessarily going to happen, but
Trump being restored is probably one of the more likely things to happen. People aren't going to get, I don't know, like people are not going to, I don't know if people are going to get their suspended accounts back, but Trump being returned to Twitter, I think that's pretty likely.
Yeah, well, I think I mean that would be good. I'd love to see it, but I'll also say this: I don't know how familiar you are with Musk and his sort of business strategy and how he operates with things, but from what I can tell and from what I've seen in like interviews and his own sort of business practices, he's kind of hands off. Like he gets these. I mean, he's a total autist. All right, like he's very autistic, which is cool, but he sometimes has these pet projects that he gets really really in depth with, things like SpaceX and other things and Tesla. But in general, with the myriad of businesses he has, a lot of it is hands off. He's just sort of the owner of it. And the problem with that is, I think I could very easily see Twitter becoming one of those things where he's like, all right, I own it. Well, fuck. Now who do I hire to run it? Well, these people have good resumes, so I'll just put them in. You just get the exact same thing that we had from the beginning, just with Musk's name attached to it. So I think that of all the concerns, of all the problems that are possible, I think that's probably the highest, is that he doesn't actually follow through and make it a sort of personal pet project, which he may, which would be cool. But given how he's run other things and other businesses underneath him, I don't know if I put too much stock in that.
Okay, well, that is it for everything besides the cognitive elite questions. We'll move on to that. There are some interesting questions. One I'm actually going to be answering on the IQ supplement this week, but Cargo Shorts Respecter. I'm not a Cargo Shorts Respecter, but he did ask, what are my thoughts on the Northman movie? Soso hasn't seen it yet. I have seen it. I thought it was a great movie, but I will be talking in depth about the movie later this week on the IQ supplement, so make sure you subscribe to that. So that's one question. And as a reminder, I need to give my pitch. As a reminder, you too can have the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the Cognitive Elite option at Highly Respected Substack. That's at highlyrespected.substack.com. And also make sure to subscribe to IQ supplements if you're not already subscribed to them. If you want to be truly respected, be very highly respected, you got to sign up for the IQ supplements, and they're guaranteed to boost your IQ. I don't know why you wouldn't sign up for this. But the question we are going to ask today, this is a very interesting question. This comes from he calls himself Julian. I think he wanted to say you could pronounce it as Julian, but I'm going to pronounce it properly as Julian. He has a European surname. I'm not going to dox him, so I'm pretty sure it's Julian. And he said he went to a conference with a lot of personalities from the French New Right, and the French New Right is into something called neo-paganism. And he wanted to know what do you think of neo-paganism? And is it intellectually sound? Is it something that can actually fill the role of a religion? So actually, I'm going to first give this to Soso as a question, and he's going to answer it, and then we're going to banter back and forth. This may be one of the more controversial cognitive elite questions we've addressed. But Soso, what do you think of neo-paganism?
Well, The attachment of the prefix neo sort of concerns me. Neo-paganism. I'm a big fan of original paganism. I recently watched a movie. It's a great movie. It's one of my favorite movies of all time, Breaker Morant, and it's a great tale of the Boer War. And at the end of it, there's two men facing execution, and they're asked for if they'd like the padre to speak to them, the religious father. And one of the main characters says, "No thanks, I'm a pagan." And the other character, who's also being executed, says, "Well, what's a pagan?" And the guy replies, "Well, it's someone who doesn't believe that there's a divine being dispensing justice in the world." And the other guy replies, "I'm a pagan too." So I think, fundamentally, I have a lot of attachment, sort of an emotional draw towards paganism, this idea, particularly the virtues that they describe. Some pagan, particularly northern pagans, have these seven virtues and what it promotes in regards to courage and bravery and loyalty and that sort of thing. And that appeals to me personally quite deeply. Now, I don't know how much of that is translated into neo-paganism, but paganism in general, the sort of ideas and the virtues that it espouses, which, to be fair, is also espoused by older forms of Christianity and other religions. So I'm not trying to differentiate the two there. But I think when it comes to neo-paganism, from what I've seen, there's this idea that's pretty similar to a lot of what we discussed in regards to national symbols. This idea like, oh, everything is so bad. When you look at like modern Christianity and like the current Pope and Catholicism and all these Protestant churches with women preachers and that sort of thing, it's very easy to get disgusted by that and say, it's just totally zogged. Like there's nothing to be gained here, and you revert to alternative symbols and alternative religions in this case, which I sympathize with. But if you want to look at it from a political stance, like you're not going to get, middle America to stop going to church if they go to church. And you're not going to get them to embrace Wotan and Tyr and Thor and Odin and all these other variants. But like I said, I definitely sympathize and probably am sort of one myself.
Well, I don't know. There might be an inquisition after you after this podcast, Soso. So you better be on the lookout for that. Yeah, I share a lot of similar attitudes to this. I don't. It's not going to replace Christianity, and even in some of its forms that takes in America, it's like very goofy. And then some of these people are like really into like paganism and some of the Sachu stuff. It's like if you go on TikTok and you see these things that it's like all like pride flags and stuff. It's a very weird phenomenon in America. One thing is like you see in Sachu, you could almost say that there are two sides of it. One is like white ex-cons who are who are maybe they're into the I guess more base form of heathenry, and that's like one side of it. And then the other side is like a gender queer like Cirrus or something, and it's like two very opposing sides of a Satru. It's like these like dudes who just got out of jail and they got into a Satru through jail, and then the other side that not everyone is like this, but and then the other side is like these like very freakish people. It's like what two sides you see into a lot of some of the practice groups. That's not everyone, but sometimes you may be mistaken for that attitude. But of course, these are all stereotypes. It's not necessarily true for everyone, but it is something that you do notice. It's like I said, most white people are still going to say that they're Christian. They might not be going to church as often as they were in the past or as their grandparents, and they may not be as attached to it as their parents and grandparents. But ultimately, they do see as like Christianity is like the religion of their family, and it's like where they get married, it's where they have the funerals, and it's still a part of their it's still a part, maybe not everyday life, but it's still a part of their life, and they don't necessarily feel like they want to go to something an alternative. But as I understand why people go to alternative, and even some of the stuff that like the forms of Christianity that the dissident right gets into, that's still not what the normal Christianity is for most Americans. I mean, most Americans, they're not getting into Latin Mass or Orthodoxy or any of that type of stuff. They're going to a church that's, some of these evangelical churches. Evangelical churches are fine, but even if you go to like a mainline church or even like a standard Catholic service, that's very different from what the people who are in the dissident right, the forms of Christianity they wanted to get into. So even like the people who are like, we're returning to Christianity, they're still turning to an alternative type of Christianity that's very different from the mainstream, in the same way that neo pagans are turning to an alternative religion. It's even more of an alternative religion. It's completely outside of the faith for most Americans. So as like advocating for it as like everything need to be do, I don't think that's very wise, but I do think that there's like a reason why people get into it, especially when they're confronted with a lot of the forms of a modern American Christianity and a lot of what they've been growing up with. And so people like read like the sagas and they read Homer and they get really much more inspired by that than they would by what they learned in Sunday school. So that's like some of the things. I'm not that like negative anti towards it. Like I just think it's not necessarily the wisest political strategy, and I don't necessarily think it's going to take over. But I'm definitely not anti it.
I mean, I'm likewise
I
in the
think
same boat.
I think people get really upset about it. You're reacting to something that's like a very minor niche thing in the right, and you're pretending like the real problem in the world are neo-pagans. Like there's a bunch of trads who they're not necessarily distant right people, but they're maybe associated with integralists. And some of these guys, like you would go to their Twitter feeds and you would think that like we're living in a heathen occupied government. They're like pagans are everywhere. Like they're obsessed with pagans, and they accuse everyone of being a pagan. And like if you even like have any racial attitudes or recognize race, you're somehow a pagan. And they go into this. And even like with my docs, like that was done by people who are wanting to strike back at pagans. And even these guys were necessarily right wingers, but they're like, we have to get rid of the pagans. And it's like, I don't think this is like the real, we're not living in, as I said, we're not living in heathen occupied government. Even if you're like saying like this stuff is goofy or I don't, what they're about, like that's the complete opposite of my religious beliefs. It's whatever. This is not the real problem. I think that even on the right, people are there's gonna be people on the right with like a ton of different religious attitudes and beliefs. And a lot of people are just gonna have to get along and not try to wage inquisitions or jihads against each other over their beliefs or force their beliefs on each other. Is that many people are gonna have different beliefs, and as long as they're not a total freak show, I think it should be fine.
Like I said, likewise, I'm pretty much in the same boat there. And you mentioned earlier, it's curious that you have this dichotomy of like ex-prison convicts and uh, really, really far down the line dissident writers, in addition to like LGBTQ fucking pagans. And ultimately, it all stems from the same thing, right? Alienation. These people are seeking an identity that gives their life meaning and purpose. And I think if you find that in whatever it may be, whether it's, embrace Odin or become Orthodox, whatever, your personal uh, religious your faith may be, if you find satisfaction in that, more power to you. But trying to treat that personal satisfaction as like the be all end all answer to all of our problems is ridiculous. And there is something to be said about the decline of the West being intrinsically tied to spiritual rot. Like I agree with that, but this idea that all of the problems that face us can be solved by attending Latin mass or by putting a totem up in the woods is ridiculous, and it's really no different than the idea that you're going to spark this rural revolution, or you're really into sports ball and you think this team's better than that team and that's my team no matter what. It's just a distraction.
Yeah, and I agree. And some people go as far as that they get so worked up about pagans that they become anti, like like the sagas and like mythology and stuff, and they're just like, we want to burn all this stuff, and it's like, why? It's
Yeah.
even if you don't believe in it, and most people don't believe in it, it's like you should just view these stories as like Lord of the Rings or like fantasy. It's like something that you're gonna enjoy. Maybe it might not depict the world or the reality as is, but I don't think that there's like, and prior to Christianity, I mean, your ancestors would have believed this, and so it's and people appreciated this. Many Christians appreciated this literature for many, many years, and there's no reason to go on a crusade about this. The one thing is that even though there's like so many like freaks and weirdos into paganism, and there's so many different elements of it, but I guess the very Norse element of it does, even if the people into it are not wanting to admit this, it does dive into a kind of implicit. I'm trying to use this careful words, but it is an implicit expression of some of what we're about, even when they're like admiring Vikings or the old mythology and stuff. It is like admiring like this old warriors who are out like free of the modern world. They're free of the current standards that you have to live under and political correctness, and they're just going out and doing badass masculine things. And I think that is like in some ways the appeal of it in sort of ways with these stories, because they are full of these stories of these guys upholding a morality that's at odds with the contemporary world, and that they are doing things that we demonize like masculine white people for doing. And it's one of the few expressions you'll see, positive expressions of threatening white masculinity you will see in media. And even though a lot of these people are just like, we're inclusive, we're anti-racist, we're for diversity, and we love our transgender Vikings or whatever, it doesn't really fit with the source material that they're going towards. Like the source material is the complete opposite of anything that the current order stands for. And it even goes back to Homer and everything else. And this is like why the French New Right was into it, is that this presented a complete antithesis of liberalism, and that's why they were upholding it. But a lot of the people who are getting into paganism, they just want a super liberal religion. They feel that Christianity is insufficient and truly upholding progressive values, and they hope that Asatru or whatever will be the more progressive religion, and that's why they turn to it. But then when they actually read the source material, there is absolutely no evidence for liberalism or modern political correctness.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. One side gets into it because Christianity is too gay, and then one side gets into it because Christianity isn't gay enough.
that is the real dichotomy of this. And if you guys read the sagas, I was just recently reading the sagas to prepare to watch the Northmen, and Northmen will probably lead to a lot more of these discussions, but because it's like an extremely pagan film. I don't want to give too many away, but we'll get into that in the IQ supplement. But even the film, like this film is not meant to like celebrate Vikings as progressive, diverse, genderqueer individuals who just like going around killing bigoted Christians who are stuck in their white privilege. Like, no, these guys are like threatening white people, going out and doing terrible things and like living by an honor code that we would think is like evil, but they're the heroes of the story. And that's a part of the appeal. And I think the left-wing neo-pagans, at least into the Asatru, are getting that wrong because they're completely at odds with the source material versus the more right-wing Asatru. So that's just my final thoughts on it. Any further thoughts, Soso, on that topic?
No, I think you tied it up pretty well there.
All right, we did. So we're solving all these problems today with this podcast. But that is it for the show today. So you got some things to promote.
No, I don't have anything personally.
You got
to
a
plug.
Twitter account to promote, don't you?
I've got a Twitter account. Follow me at Chernaya Koshka. Soso on Twitter. And I'll throw out some friendly plugs. Definitely subscribe to the IQ supplement, Scott Greer.
Right,
all the information and all the intelligence you could ever ask for. Subscribe to BAP's podcast, Caribbean Rhythms, and then my good friends over at Russians with Attitude if you want the real scoop on the Ukraine business.
Hey, that's great. You know, when the Russians with Attitude came on the IQ supplement, I ended the podcast. I was like, don't you guys have things to promote? And they're like, yeah, we've got a podcast. And I was like, do you want to tell people where to follow them? They're like, oh yeah, we have a podcast. And it's like, where? And then I had to eventually promote it for them. You know, the Russians with Attitude do not have, are not Russians with the entrepreneurial spirit. So are the online grifter mindset. So they are not in promo mode. So it was really funny, but they have different mindsets. So
They're just not wasp like us, you know.
no,
They
they're
don't
not lost.
understand the
They're not.
business
They're not
mindset.
used car salesmen. Within every American is a used car salesman who's
Hell
out
yeah.
there. Well, that's the true spirit of America.
Hell
Russia,
yeah.
they're just like, I may have a car. It might run. I don't know. I don't know where it's at.
Yeah, exactly. It's
But
got a
that's a
Z painted
completely
on it.
different mentality. But that is it for today. Thanks for coming on, Sosa. Make sure to follow his Twitter account, which I will have to spell. I don't actually. I'm not going to spell it out here because you're not going to see it. But when I promote the show, you'll see his handle, and the handle will be in the YouTube description. So that's it for today. And thanks for coming on, Soso. And until next time, stay respected.